First things first, decolonisation. Can you give us a pithy definition? Because we hear it bandied about, and yet at the same time, we're not quite sure what it is.
Well, decolonisation refers to the period when you had the dissolution of the European empires. So politically, that was the process of decolonisation, i.e. how former colonies basically sort of sought independence through nationalist movements, sometimes communist movements, etc. So that's the formal process of political decolonisation. Decolonisation, as it appears on our campuses, refers to something that's kind of, I think you could argue would be sort of parasitic on those movements, but is far more about essentially a critique of Western civilization in the current moment. And it basically says, to cut a long story short, it draws on, and we can go into this if you want to, but it draws on a kind of some elements of Marxism, but primarily postmodern and post-structural and what are called post-colonial theories. And these essentially argue that all knowledge is contingent. There's no such thing as truth or science or objectivity. So all knowledge is contingent, and therefore there's no such thing as truth, and therefore human life is characterized by struggles over truth and meaning.
So does that mean that, like, the colonization that we're talking about, say for example at universities, is the colonization by white Western people of concepts like the truth?
Well, so essentially, what the critique that they would make, the decolonizers make, is that Western forms of knowledge, what are called white Eurocentric forms of knowledge, are fundamentally imbued with power relationships that rest on former colonial forms of rule. And what these forms of knowledge do, and they're thoroughly contingent, they're highly ideological, but what they ultimately do is they construct non-Western people and non-Western ways of knowledge as inherently inferior. And these things suffuse our culture. They're everywhere. So everything we do kind of reproduces these forms. So the decolonizers in our universities and beyond, so you see it, for example, in British institutions, the British Museum, the National Trust, they've kind of adopted this ideology, this very political ideology of decolonization, and they argue that essentially we sort of drive out the demons of white Eurocentric thought, basically, and how it reproduces structural inequalities for non-white minorities.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, it's all thoroughly contestable, by the way. None of it, if you look at the data or you get any sense of it, it's complete and utter nonsense.
Yeah.
But that's the claim.
But what's interesting, because you start the book talking all about the 2020 and the death of George Floyd and how that, kick-started things all over the world. Now here it took this form, well, apart from the statues coming down, in our institutions of this decolonisation process. I just wondered, you've been an academic now for 20 years?
Yeah.
And so it couldn't just have arrived, Doug, surely, in 2020. I mean, or maybe it did. It just, you mentioned there the institutions, they all sang from the same hymn sheet very quickly, the library, the British Library, the British Museum, Kew Gardens, virtually everyone.
Yeah.
So had this been developing over a long period?
Yeah, so there's different ways I think you can account for this tsunami wave, right? The first way is, and I kind of talk about this in the book, I think the book covers quite a lot of stuff. So it looks at a lot of the data about the claims in both the UK and the US. It looks at, I think I give a fair summary of the theories that underpin decolonisation, so post-structuralism and post-colonialism. I then critique them, I argue for science, look at history, and then look at geopolitics, and we can come on to that, I'm sure we will, about the implications of some of this, basically. But I think that, there's a number of different ways we can account for it. I think the first way we can account for it is the growth of this, what we could call kind of sort of relativism in the academy. And that really is emergent from sort of a social constructivist position on human knowledge and what's called epistemology. And that basically says So in the Western tradition, obviously, especially in the last couple of hundred years post-Enlightenment, or in the Enlightenment period, there's a primacy placed on rational adjudication, reason, to arrive at something we can call the truth, ultimately. So there is a thing out there, and there are different ways of understanding it, but ultimately those ways are testable through scientific knowledge, and then we can attain a better understanding of what exists, and then move forward in that sense. So the decolonisers draw on a different epistemology, a theory of knowledge. And they basically say there's no such thing as truth or science. In fact, those things are impositions of a white colonial mindset. To seek to understand the world is to seek to impose upon the world, to seek to control the world, ultimately. And that's a really, really bad thing. So what they argue, they kind of draw on a theorist called Michel Foucault and Jacques Derrida, and also the post-colonial theorists like Edward Said. They draw on a social constructivist epistemology, which says there's no such thing as truth or science. Ultimately, everything is kind of socially constructed. So your truth has as much validity as my truth. In other words, there's what we can call a judgmental relativism. So essentially, there's no such thing as truth. There are just different truths. There's millions of different truths, and you can see how this begins to spill out into wider culture. In terms of, if we abandon science and what I'd call ontological realism, i.e. the belief that a world exists independently of our knowledge of it. So your biology, your chromosomes exist, or gravity exists, or there is a thing called the material world. If we abandon that, basically, then we end up in this fundamentally epistemologically relativist world, where essentially my identity is the truth.
Yes.
I am what I am. And you just have to accept it. And if you don't accept it, because you have no rational education, how dare you impose your truth on me? Do you see what I mean? And so then you start going down the line of like, words are violence, silence is violence. Yep. Because drawing on Foucault and these ideas, and these aren't necessarily explicitly, they're not drawing on them theoretically explicitly, but they're now suffuse our culture. And essentially, so that therefore the way you think about the world fundamentally shapes the world. It kind of actively shapes the world, rather than your thought understanding the world as it is. Your understanding actively shapes the world. So therefore the stakes for these people become much higher. If I occupy, according to their garbled theories, a kind of colonial mindset, then I'm just by thinking those things, I'm actively oppressing a whole sets of people and categories, etc.
I see. So basically, you mentioned this has been sort of like obviously going on for a while.
Yeah.
But this particular kind of, it was almost sort of, like by arrangement around about 2020, where everyone sort of came out with this particular thing. I mean, it was hard to not to see it as kind of. Finally, we've got our chance. That was the feeling I got. These people were saying, "This is our opportunity."
Well, I think so. I completely agree. So I think what you had was you had that general sort of the takeover of the humanities and social sciences in the Anglophone institutions, and it's notably the Anglophone institution, the UK and the US in particular. So you had that, and then you had obviously the election of Trump in 2016. And then suddenly there was this sense of political and moral urgency. There was kind of what some people call Trump derangement syndrome, where essentially he was seen as the Antichrist, the manifestation of white supremacy. So suddenly the active shaping of our cultural narratives took on a very strong political urgency, particularly on the West Coast. So if you look at a lot of the stuff that we've sort of swum through in the last 5 years in particular, a lot of it really comes out of a tiny part of the US and very powerful tech corporations. So you had the kind of Trump derangement syndrome, then you had the Brexit derangement syndrome too in this country, again incorrectly seen as some sort of a short goose step away from fascism. How dare working class people express their political agency against liberal hegemony that's been kind of pretty much enjoyed its day in the sun for the last 40 odd years without contestation. How dare they do that? So you had that too, basically, and then so combined with this kind of this system in the universities, this way of thinking that became dominant. this kind of various Anglophone derangement, catastrophization processes taking place, very powerful parts of American capitalism and capital, right? Very powerful on the West Coast, and then beyond that, the adoption of a kind of a new moral economy in the Anglophone institutions. And what do I mean by that? I mean basically in what we've seen as the Anglophone economies have changed, the US and EU economy have changed, you've seen the increased supranationalization, but also the emergence of new cultural elites as well. And to my mind at least, one of the ways in which these cultural elites maintain power, and the elite ultimately wants to maintain power, right? One of the ways it does it is it kind of generates a politics of vulnerability. It's parasitic, and it generates this notion of a politics of vulnerability. And it says basically there are these endlessly vulnerable, often minority groups, but groups in general. And you see this, it's a very powerful moral narrative. COVID, the vulnerable populations, ethnic minorities, vulnerable populations, vulnerable populations, and so essentially the articulation of a politics of vulnerability. And what's the solution to that? To give these cultural elites more power to fix these problems, to look after these problems, to look after these vulnerable. And if you don't, you're a moral monster. You're a moral monster. How can you know what I mean? So essentially, therefore, you've got this sort of the theoretical discussions and elements on the campus. You've got a kind of catastrophization in the Anglophone economies, and you've got new technocratic elites that have emerged, basically, that have kind of suffused this politics of vulnerability. Endlessly vulnerable populations, and you have to give them power to fix and to look after these populations.
You sort of